Welcome to this short presentation by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the Fraud Advisory Panel and Perpetuity. For those of you who don't know, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners is the largest anti-fraud organisation in the world. We've got nearly 90,000 members in over 154 different countries. And it's the CFE, the ACFE's own credential, is the global recognised benchmark in fraud examination. In each country where we have a presence, we work tirelessly to educate and reduce the risk of fraud and increase the awareness of fraud. Despite being the largest reported category of crime in the UK, fraud victims are not receiving justice. In England, the debate over whether the reporting of fraud should be mandatory has been long running. The issue is important and significant for a number of reasons. The impact on resources, the measurement of fraud, the reporting process, the responsibility of corporate governance, and the response to organised crime are just some of the factors to be considered. The UK chapter decided to commission some independent academic research from a company with both the experience and gravitas to explore the issue. We asked the Fraud Advisory Panel, an important and influential voice in law reform and public policy improvement, and whose mission, like our own, is to educate and advise, to assist us on our quest. I was surprised by the results of the research, and I think you will be too. It may be that this issue needs to be explored more comprehensively to determine a suitable way forward or response. I hope that the work is seen to be beneficial both to ACFE members and to the public at large, and I hope it goes some way to influencing the UK's response to the pandemic that is fraud. And now I hand you over to Mia Campbell from the Fraud Advisory Panel.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning to everyone who has joined today. When Tim first approached us earlier this year for our views on topics worthy of research, we wanted to suggest an area that could really benefit from a fresh look and new insights. And one area that immediately sprung to mind, which has always been a particular focus or of interest to us at the Fraud Advisory Panel, was the issue of fraud reporting by organisations to the authorities. The last time the subject was examined in any real depth, as far as we can recall, was back with the 2006 fraud review. And it found little support for the introduction of additional reporting requirements on corporates. But of course, the world has changed quite significantly over the past 15 years, and so too has the UK's fraud fighting landscape. We know a significant amount of fraud is not reported to the authorities and to the police, and the reasons for this are well documented, especially for individuals and consumers. But what is less clear is whether corporate attitudes and perceptions about fraud reporting have changed over the last decade, and if so, how? We also wanted to explore whether the same barriers, such as reputational damage and concerns that the police won't investigate the reports that they receive, remain the same today as they did all that time ago. And we hope this research goes some way towards filling this gap. As you will shortly hear, it certainly highlights some important learning points for the police, regulators and others in respect of how to encourage, as a minimum, more voluntary reporting by organisations. It also raises some interesting points on corporate governance and corporate attitudes towards fraud. As a result of this research, the ACFE and the Fraud Advisory Panel are today calling on government to do three things. Firstly, to make tackling fraud a national priority and to resource it properly. Secondly, to streamline existing mechanisms to make reporting of fraud much easier. And thirdly, we are asking government to do more to encourage organisations to manage fraud as part of their corporate social responsibility. I think it's fair to say that when we went into this research, we did so with an open mind. And as Tim's already explained, the results have actually surprised us, and we think it will surprise you too. I will now hand over to Martin and to Janice to share the findings of their research with us. Martin, over to you.
Mia and Tim, thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to let you into a little secret that when I was first approached, Tim and I discussed this research many moons ago, that two associations with two groups were going to be involved. There's always a slight nervousness when you're a researcher, because you're always thinking, will the associations, will the groups always agree on philosophy, approach, and what have you? They were fantastic. Tim and Mia and both groups, thank you very much indeed for your support and for your enthusiasm. Talking of which, another little secret and a bit of a surprise was I'm not sure I've ever done a research project in all my time, and I'm old as you can see, where we received so many comments when we provided the option to comment in the survey. It was just phenomenal. So thank you very much indeed to all of you who did respond, who advised us in different ways. And clearly the object now is to present these findings to you. So what's going to happen is that my colleague, Dr. Janice Goldstraw-White, who led the research on this, is going to briefly go through some of the headline findings with you. And then we're going to give you the opportunity to ask any questions or prompt thoughts for discussion. So if I could ask you to use the question and answer button, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, to ask any questions that you've got. If you can get them in early, either to us as researchers, or if you wish to Mia or Tim, we'll endeavour to incorporate them in the ensuing discussion. So question and answer button at the bottom. It may be that as Janice is speaking and providing you with insight, you've got some thoughts, and we'll endeavour to answer them best we can. There's also a chat button, and that's for you just to exchange ideas with another and thoughts if you wish. But question and answer button for your questions, please do get them in early. Without further ado then, I'm going to pass over to Janice, who's going to go through some of the headline findings, and then afterwards I'll see you for the discussion. Janice, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Well, as we've all explained so far, the idea of this report was to update the position on the reporting of fraud by organisations. As Mia said, probably haven't looked at this for a decade or so. So the idea really was to better understand what the benefits and drawbacks might be of actually introducing a requirement to make fraud reporting mandatory in England and Wales. And really part of the background to that was there's no current requirement for organisations in those countries to report a fraud should they actually become a victim of crime, although obviously Action Fraud encourage you to make reports. We've always known that the reporting of fraud for organisations has been very low and continues to be so. Really, this reporting is in contrast to requirements, for example, for the offence of money laundering, where we know through the legislation there, organisations, or certainly certain organisations, financial organisations, are required to make reports through suspicious activity reports, although that has a limited sort of benefits for overall reporting of fraud, and has faced some criticisms in the past as well. So really, we also wanted to find out, have others actually implemented compulsory reporting of fraud in other jurisdictions and countries? And if so, what can we learn from them in terms of experience, how they promoted it, what were the barriers they came up across, and obviously what we can do to avoid those situations as well. So moving on to this sort of approach and methodology of the work, it's based on feedback from 209 survey respondents, and probably one of the first I've come across in terms of a piece of research that where the actual survey was started by respondents, they actually completed all the questions, and that's probably pretty unique. And what we found from there was that 75% of these were manager or above level, half of those from the private sector, 40 from the public sector, with the remaining in the sort of third and voluntary not-for-profit sector, and then a few that actually worked across a number of these sectors. We also ran 2 events, mainly a round table to talk to experts, and also a webinar event, which is part of the Perpetuity's thought leadership programme. We invited experts there to discuss should the reporting of fraud be made compulsory. And during the round table, we engaged with as many experts as we could within the UK working in the fraud profession. and to put their views forward. Finally, we undertook interviews with experts and legal representatives from these other jurisdictions and countries operating a similar fraud reporting scheme or an all offences reporting scheme to find out what their views were on how well they thought that was working. And overall, as all three speakers have said so far, we found that survey respondents were generally in favour of making the reporting of fraud mandatory, which was probably quite a surprise to what we've seen previously. But that was qualified by the fact that they said the aims for doing so need to be clearly articulated. If we're going to put this money and effort into this, we need to see exactly what it is you want from this and to minimise our costs on doing that. A number of barriers, of course, were identified, and if the system was to be introduced, these need to be identified and addressed before continuing on with that. And I think one of the important things we need to stress here is that organisations need to see the benefits of reporting need to outweigh the potential cost to organisations. Probably something easier said than done. Okay, looking at the figures then, so we said just over half were in favour of fraud reporting being made compulsory for all types of frauds at all levels, and a further quarter of respondents said yes, but only for certain frauds, certainly those that are financially material to the organisation. A fifth said it shouldn't be introduced at all, and a few remaining 4% there weren't sure. There's obviously, from the feedback, a number of benefits and drawbacks for introducing mandatory reporting. So if we just have a look at those now, one of the greatest benefits would be, it would increase the awareness of actually this damaging type of offence and give an opportunity to gain a better overall impression of fraud and the extent of fraud, on the basis that if you don't know about it, you can't do anything about it. And certainly by getting a better impression, you facilitate a better assessment of the most appropriate response to fraud and tackling it in our country. As we spoke about earlier, this is quite low on the government agenda at times, and hopefully this is one of many ways we can hope to escalate things up the government agenda more and get a greater focus on fraud. And I think continuing in the way we've actually said, some respondents said, it's actually the government is sending out the wrong message, and in a way, by not paying attention to it, we're actually normalising fraud, and in which case nothing will ever get done about it. Provide better intelligence for police. As we know, frauds are often long-running, they're hidden. Many are designed to commit very similar types of crimes of a similar type, sometimes even very low-value ones. So if police know about these and know who's committing these, we've got a better chance of actually intervening earlier and to stop it sooner, and less people getting victimised. Also, we need to put some of the onus on organisations. We need to take this seriously now. We need to encourage organisations to take more responsibility for managing fraud and creating a framework and culture to do so, and just generally give more priority to tackling fraud in their risk assessments of their organisations. Obviously, there are drawbacks, and if a system were to be introduced, these need to be looked at. And I think one of the biggest ones that was pointed out with respondents is, police are already really overwhelmed and not coping with the current levels of frauds that are being reported. We know this because very few frauds are investigated, and even less so are prosecuted. And just by making more reports, we're going to overwhelm the police. So that is something obviously that needs consideration. Also, organisations said there's already a high level of current reporting requirements on ourselves on a number of issues, and if we were required to do more, this is just placing an additional onus and administrative burden on us. So literally, if a system was to be introduced, we need to look at making this as simple and as easy as possible to avoid making that burden as small as possible. Also, there were suggestions by some people that maybe why not, instead of asking everybody to report fraud, is why not look at what we think are the gaps what are we actually currently missing, and maybe we should be concentrating on those rather than asking everybody to report. Likewise, people also pointed out that, you know, there's already a lot of data, fraud data already being reported by various agencies, and how well is this being used? Maybe this should be assessed before actually requesting any more data. Finally, it was pointed out that, you know, there's potential unfairness here of actually re-victimising the victim, the person that's already, the organisation that's already been victimised through having a fraud committed against them, and now face the fact that they may be prosecuted for not reporting a fraud. So I think there needs to be consideration on that as well. The barriers to fraud obviously are issues to consider, but there are other drawbacks that were pointed out as well. And we need to come up with some solutions to these should we go forward with the reporting of fraud. We need to demonstrate the benefits of reporting. Some organisations pointed out to us, you know, we actually have a budget for fraud losses. Our income allows us to do that. And some argued it might actually cost us more to investigate than the fraud loss itself, certainly where these were smaller amounts. So we need to sell the benefits of reporting, and certainly one of the things was actually getting some feedback from what's already been reported at the moment. There's also a discussion about, you know, what the level of fraud should actually be reported. But as was pointed out, if you didn't include all fraud, sometimes, as we said, by the nature of frauds, which is sometimes small scale but large volume, we might be missing whole schemes that are going on throughout the country. So there's an argument for sort of having large amounts reported, and also there's an argument for also including smaller amounts as well. Hopefully then, for the introduction of mandatory reporting, this could refocus organisational culture. When we asked people if they thought that management, the fact that it would reflect badly on their management team would be an impediment to reporting, close to 2/3 of respondents believe this would be the case and that managers wouldn't report. But many others also highlighted that they need to hold their board and senior managers to account now. And I think, as one person correctly said, really, now's the time to remove the option of remaining silent on fraud. Talked about there obviously would be an administrative burden by asking for more reporting, and there's some concerns about this, particularly in terms of certain organisations being able to capture and report the incidents of fraud, whether their systems were up to that, and especially this was the case for smaller organisations. I think respondents really overwhelmingly agreed that the key way forward here was, if a system was introduced, that this must be a simple system with clear definitions for categories of reporting that provided the least amount of burden on organisations. And there was also suggestions that maybe for smaller organisations and those with difficulties in reporting, to have a slightly different system, what somebody termed reporting light for such smaller organisations. As we spoke about earlier, as Mia said in previous reports that they've undertaken at the Fraud Advisory Panel, there's always been a focus on what about the reputational harm if you actually report fraud. And when we asked about this really hasn't changed. And I think this was one of the barriers that received the greatest attention, with 87% still feeling this could be a major barrier for actually reporting fraud. So I think there needs to be consideration about that as well for organisations. And in particular, the area of charities was highlighting what impact this may have on their sort of income generation and reputation. Organisations obviously also need to be not seen as a soft target. I think that some of them feel, by actually reporting fraud, they have a fear of being targeted by other similar offenders because their systems might be seen as easy pickings and weak. And also they were concerned about retribution by other organisations, possibly premiums with insurance companies, and different sanctions that might be imposed upon by regulators should they report a fraud. But also I think one of the barriers that needs to be overcome is managing the expectations of organisations if they were to report fraud. One of the reasons that organisations said that they might not report a fraud, and this was up to 61% of respondents said this, was that actually dealing with it within their organisation after they actually reported a fraud, what they now had to do something about it. And this obviously then raises the question then of whether organisations should be required to investigate reports that they may have to report. When we actually asked respondents about this, approximately half said that all organisations should be required to investigate frauds, with nearly half saying it depended on, a quarter said that they would have to report all frauds, with nearly a half saying, well, it depended on the size of the fraud and the individual organisation and what capacity they had. There were some comments here that maybe it should be left to the private sector, certainly to not have this dictated to them. And obviously that might reflect on the 28% that said, no, it should be left to the individual organisation to actually decide on the appropriate course of action once they'd actually found and reported a fraud. I think three main areas were of concern in this area in terms of investigations afterwards. Was one, the available skill sets of individual organisations in terms of what different employees they had to investigate fraud, and really more so they were concerned about the consequences of getting it wrong. Would they actually be stigmatising individuals where that was incorrect, and more so would they actually be getting would they be stepping on an investigation which later, if brought to court, would actually be thrown out because of something they did wrong very early on. Secondly, it wasn't felt appropriate that individual organisations should actually be investigating on their own certain serious and organised frauds, whether it's appropriate for them to actually get involved in these organisations on their own. As we talked about earlier, there's often very similar frauds committed over a large area and great volume, and really there's no great merit for individual frauds being investigated by single organisations here, and it was felt that they should sort of band together here at least to actually look at some of these. And finally, in some instances, people pointed out, well, for certain frauds within organisations, there's actually a conflict of interest in terms of organisation investigating themselves. So if mandatory reporting was actually to be introduced, we tried to think about what possible forms this might take. So we asked survey respondents to comment on 4 individual different types of ways of going forwards with this. And really, this would be determined by the nature and aims and objectives of actually why mandatory reporting of fraud would be introduced. It would depend on how you would collect that data. For example, if it was that one of the top aims was to get a full landscape picture of fraud, then obviously coming up with a system that only reported frauds over a certain amount would not fulfil this aim. So I think the aims and objectives need to be fully examined before an individual system could actually be chosen. 4 choices we actually gave them consisted of mainly a legal route and a governance route. The first 3 really received the same kind of response, and sort of 70% approximately agreed for a legalistic approach. And these 3 approaches were, bringing in new fraud-specific legislation just to do with fraud. Or we could potentially bring new legislation in for having a duty to report all offences, which obviously would include fraud as well. Or we could look at existing legislation. I think the obvious one here would be for money laundering, and to look at expanding those. As I said, they all received about 70% of the votes. Surprisingly, because I think we thought that as this would be a slightly simpler way of doing things and maybe something that could be introduced in the interim, having an annual fraud statement attached to organisations, possibly reported to somebody like Companies House or something similar, received probably only 30% of the votes, and that seemed to be less favoured by respondents. We also asked about who should have the duty and liability to actually report, and in terms of who this should be, overwhelmingly respondents said that it should be the board, senior managers and auditors. They were the groups most likely to have to report. But it did include obviously a tenth of people that said this shouldn't be compulsory for anybody to report. But obviously there was also comments included that really fraud was everybody's responsibility, and anybody that knew about a fraud had a duty to report it. As we said earlier, one of the second aims of this piece of work was to actually try and learn from other places in terms of other jurisdictions and countries. And if we heard more about their experiences, perhaps we would be able to see how we could overcome some of our issues. So we talked to a number of places, and really we found that the reporting of fraud is mandatory for a number of different types of employees in certain areas. This includes jurisdictions such as the European Union, Commonwealth employees, at some places in the US, certainly not at a federal level, but at a state level, and that varies between different states within the United States. We concentrated on 3 countries really and got a little bit more detail from them. That included Ireland, Scotland and South Africa. They'd all brought in mandatory reporting of fraud for different reasons, probably South Africa in the 80s and 90s, where they were trying to look at improving their corporate governance generally within the country, whereas more so in Ireland and Scotland, it was brought in mainly to counter more serious organised crime in the first instance. I think we have to remember when we're talking about Scotland, they don't have the Fraud Act like we do in England and Wales. The type of legislation they've got in all these countries varies from what we talked about early. Some have all offence specific type legislation where anybody who knows about any particular offence has to report. It has a duty to report, and obviously that will include fraud as well. Or it may be that they have laws, certainly in Ireland they do, that are more sort of fraud specific. In terms of individuals who it applies to, like we talked about earlier, in South Africa it just relates to certain officers within organisations, those officers of a certain seniority, or those that are in a particular financial or corporate governance role, who will be expected to know about such fraudulent activities. Whereas in Scotland and Ireland it relates to anybody who knows or come about a fraud. This brings out certain sort of issues, obviously, that includes people's spouses and partners, and obviously that's not necessarily a legal clear-cut situation, because even if that was brought to court, it probably could carry very little weight attached to such evidence. But basically in Scotland and Ireland, they're saying anybody that knows should report. In terms of actually bringing in that different legislation in those countries and how successful were they, there was little publicity at first in all the countries, certainly in South Africa. It didn't take off at first, but then certain fraud organisations got hold of the information and it was promoted more. In Scotland, it was brought in as part of a much sort of broader legislation, with very little attention paid to it at all, and a lot of people even still in Scotland who it applies to are really not very aware of this requirement at all. In Ireland, as I said, that was fraud specific, so it had a little bit more publicity there. Prosecutions therefore can be made for a number of routes, and when we looked at the actual sanctions for non-reporting, we found a bit of a swing the other way in terms of support for this. So although we found obviously 3/4 of people were in favour of making the mandatory reporting of fraud, only 37% agreed that actually the not reporting of this should become a criminal offence, and actually 39% disagreed that it shouldn't be a criminal offence at all. Many felt that this was just one step too far. In terms of prosecutions in those other countries we consulted with, there's actually been very few, if any, undertaken. We did manage to find, and only really through a freedom of information request, a couple in Scotland, one of which had been gone to court and been found guilty, the other which had been thrown out, and people in the other countries weren't really aware of any great number of prosecutions. So obviously we asked respondents how do they feel this would translate if it was introduced in England and Wales, and really we shouldn't be surprised to know that they said, well, not really, the same thing's going to happen here. And they pointed out three other things really: that we've already got low rates for actually committing fraud itself. So really, when you're talking about being prosecuted for not reporting a fraud, why would you think that that would actually be any different? And actually pointing out, well, the fact maybe resources in some way should be more towards pointing at actually getting the fraud offenders rather than those that are not reporting the frauds. Secondly, I think by the very nature of fraud, we know it's difficult, it's sometimes a hidden crime, spanning a long time periods, not always easy to identify an actual victim or let alone a perpetrator. So it was very difficult to actually find who would actually not report, not knowing about this kind of fraud. And finally, tying into what the response was of the 37% that didn't think offences was the best route to go for, we found that that individuals found that sanctions were probably more favoured in terms of fines or different sanctions rather than actually making this a criminal offence. So I think in summary, we could say, you know, there's clearly a clean appetite, probably more than we originally thought, for making the mandatory reporting of fraud by organisations compulsory. But obviously we've seen there's a number of barriers, as well as with the advantages, that need to be considered before we do this. And a lot of it comes back to looking at the aims and the objectives of actually introducing it in the first place and the scope of that reporting. But obviously we need to think about organisations. We need to persuade organisations, you know, the costs and the benefits of reporting. They certainly need more feedback, and they certainly need more support in actually encouraging that putting fraud on their agenda. And really that's also starting at the top with the boards, but it's also starting at the top within our country in terms of the government putting it up on their agenda. So I'll just pass you back now then to Martin, who's just going to outline some of the things we're doing at Perpetuity, and then we'll be looking to take questions and answers from you individually.
Thank you very much indeed, Janice. So just very briefly, while we're talking about doing things well in the fraud world, just to remind you about the Tackling Economic Crime Awards, the Tekkers. This is where all the leading fraud associations, all those involved in different aspects of economic crime, are engaged. They all nominate a judge. There's lots of different categories. Entries have closed for this year. Just to let you know, the awards are made on the 6th of December on a free virtual event. So please do look out for that. And we'd love to see you there to celebrate who's doing things right. It really does matter that we point to those who are doing rather well across the tackling economic crime landscape. And you'll be able to see who's won on the 6th of April, and entries for 2022 open next April. So 6th of December for this year, April next year for opening the awards. Let's now then go to some questions. Oh, sorry, a report. Just to remind you, this will stay on the screen. You can download the report free of charge that we've been speaking about today from our website. It's there for you to go and collect right now. It's also available from ACFE and Fraud Advisory Panel. And I will be involving Tim and Mia, who are still here, by the way, in the background, in some of the answers to the many questions that have cropped up. So without further ado, Janice, let me just involve you in a sort of few factual ones. Edward Nakuna just did mention this point about whether we include suspicious reporting. Of course, this was an issue for us, wasn't it, about the whole issue of when does the suspicion become an actual offence? Because it would always be possible for an organisation to say, well, we haven't investigated to confirm it, therefore it's still a suspicion, therefore it doesn't count. It's a problem.
Yes, obviously, as I pointed out, the suspicious reporting area was an area we looked at first, and really we needed to consider, well, how well does that work? How well would that apply? And does it include all frauds? Well, for a start, the suspicious activity reporting only includes certain organisations and certain frauds. So that it wasn't going to pick up absolutely everything. And secondly, there's been some criticisms of SARS recently, and obviously any system that will be designed for reporting frauds, we'd like to avoid these. And one of that was pointed out was it's become such a sort of onerous burden to do that people are a little bit scared of not reporting. So some of the quality of the reports that are actually being reported aren't very good, aren't very detailed. And if the reporting of fraud went forward, that would be looked to avoid that and to work more with organisations about the actual reporting system.
Yeah, okay, Janice, thank you very much indeed. And Khalid Salahuddin makes the point that in Southeast Asia, there are already regulatory requirements to report to the central bank on a quarterly basis. And of course, this is a point that you raised during the presentation, that many of the companies that, or the representatives we spoke to, made the point there's already a lot of reporting requirements. There's already a burden there. And it's a rather interesting question because Richard Clark says, as an investigator with National Trading Standards Scams team, I'm mindful that reporting investigation is through a variety of portals, not just the police. What are your findings around a joined up approach and sharing of information, which is currently not undertaken? I put the two questions together, Janice, because there is this point that there's already a lot of reporting and it's not currently shared through different agencies. That's certainly a barrier that would need to be thought through in terms of making the case.
Yes, certainly, Martin. And I'm going to say that's why we pointed out really that there perhaps needs to be some kind of audit at least of what current reporting requirements are around, and is there what are the potential gaps, and also I think in terms of what we've already got, how useful is that? Now it all comes back once again to actually saying, well, what are the aims and objectives of actually making fraud reporting compulsory, and it's, some of these aims potentially could already be fulfilled by what we're already reporting on. I don't know if Mia wants to pick up any more on that, because I know it's something that the Fraud Advisory Panel have looked at in terms of individual organisations, the reporting requirements there. Did you want to say anything there, Mia?
Well, Janice, I'll come out to Mia in a minute if I might,
okay,
because I want to bring Mia and Tim on the next question. Let me just come back to you for an interpretation on a matter that may feed into that. Andrew Webster says, of the 50% who said all should be recorded and 48% who said they should be investigated, was there any distinct trends in terms of sector, public, private?
no, there wasn't any particular.
No, exactly. So rather interesting on that front. Let's take your offer then. I'm going to bring in Mia and Tim, if I might, because Jenny Reid has asked a question, Mia. On this specific point, much of the feedback seems to be materiality dependent. Given that many fraudsters start off small and work up to larger, more complex frauds, is there any sort of thoughts you've got about approach to fraud reporting that incorporates a materiality threshold? So Mia, I'll come to you first, because this seems to feed right into some things you've been thinking about.
Thanks very much, Martin, and thank you to everybody for their questions. They're really good. In terms of, firstly, maybe if I could just address the point that Richard Clark made in relation to a joined up approach in the sharing of information, which is not already undertaken. I just wanted to say that's a really important point, and I think, from a fraud advisory panel perspective, we would like to see much more of a joined up approach in this area and a greater sharing of information, and that's something that we have talked about quite consistently in the past. It's something we've pressed for and we will continue to press for. So again, we just think it's a really important point, and fully in favour of that. I think it's really important to really take this response further and to make sure that we are working collectively to tackle the problem that is fraud. In terms of Jenny's comment in relation to the materiality question, I think that's a really interesting point, and it's certainly something that was being covered by the Bayes report, and there are some requirements on organisations already to disclose certain information in their accounts. I think there is a lot of work going on in this space, and I to some extent I would say it's a case of let's wait and see what BEIS come out of once they've had a chance to analyse all those results. I think it will be very informative in terms of perhaps shaping this conversation a bit more as we move forward as well. I don't know whether or not Tim has anything that he would like to add to that at all.
Tim.
Thank you. Yes, guys, I do actually. I mean, I think the materiality aspect is important. From my point of view, we don't want a position where every expense is fraud. So everybody who claims for a meal when they've actually had a packet of crisps or a hamburger, I mean, that's just going to make things completely impossible. I think that I'm kind of viewing this from the point of view of when a fraud is big enough to impact on shareholders, for example. That's when I think it definitely should be mandatory, because you know the board members can hold this out and try and ride the wave, or do lots of other things, including facilitating other frauds to prevent the reporting actually taking place, to prevent the company going under. So I do think that, if we take it down a level where we say, you know, we're talking about minor frauds or frauds that don't, you know, have an impact on the company or the shareholders, then I think we're going to go down the impossibility road. As we know, there's already so many frauds at the moment. I mean, if we said, right, what about every fraud that was a ransomware attack or a phishing attack or anything like that, the figures would just be impossible to deal with. So I do think there needs to be a materiality requirement. What the answer is, though, I don't know. I think we need to do more work on this and be more specific. But the fact is, the independent research shows that there's a favour. People are in favour of actually reporting, which is the surprise to me. So I think we're going to need to do some more work on this. Although exactly how to take it forward, I'm going to probably need to get some advice from Martin and Janice.
Look forward to that conversation, Tim, and thank you for your thoughts on that. Andrew Clark raised is a good point, and I'll keep Tim and Mia here if I might, because they might want to join in the background. And maybe we can take down the slide now and just have everyone's faces on screen. So Andrew makes the point that expanding the corporate liability of failure to prevent crimes. Now, this whole debate is going on across the security sector about a duty to protect, a failure to prevent. This all sort of heads in the right direction if you want to make things compulsory. I mean, there's a route and a mechanism to take things forward. Janice, just come to you first. Of course, this is a bigger issue, but it is a route, isn't it? It's a route in to taking things forward.
Yes, it's definitely a route in, and obviously we acknowledge that work is ongoing as well in the report. And I think generally there's a trend throughout the world now on a legal side that there's going to be more sort of duty to report type offences, and so it definitely is a route in. I think there's a number of routes in, and I think we need to also perhaps think, you know, depending on the aims on objectives, there may necessarily not be one route. I think there's going to be more than one aim and an objective for mandatory reporting, so that there could be several routes here.
Yeah, okay. I mean, interesting. Well, this will unfold. But for those of you out there on some mission, here's a chance. Mia, has this got into your thinking at all? This chance to sort of tag it on to current debates about failure to prevent and duty to protect?
I think it's absolutely. I think it's a great opportunity to explore this in a bit more detail and see how it could work practically on the ground. And some of the proposed legislation, particularly around corporate liability, does raise, I guess, the prospect of having a bit more of a detailed discussion and debate about whether or not mandatory reporting or something similar could be incorporated within that legislation.
Yeah, it's a route. It's not an easy one though. It sounds good, right? But it's not going to be easy. Let me move on, because if I could keep Tim and Mia here, if I might, because it's a chance for you to involve in sort of issues that take us beyond the research itself and looking at the implications. I'll come. Let me take this sandwich question next, and maybe Tim, I could come to you about this, about a direct link between the culture of the organisation and the occurrence of fraud. So the point being is, we didn't try and look at the cause of fraud. We were merely making a understanding of the implications of what mandatory reporting might do, whether it be possible to do, and what the arguments for and against it were. But the key point, I think, Tim, is about organisations doing more internally to raise the profile of fraud. In other words, it's all very well to say to government and others, but there is a case of get your act together and start doing it internally. Fair point, Tim, or not?
Yes, I mean, the ACFE's philosophy, if you like, has always been tone at the top. You know, you've got to have the buy-in of the senior managers, the shareholders, the board members. It's got to start at the top. Too often we find that fraud is designated to somebody down below who's got very little responsibility, and that the senior management are paying kind of lip service to this. They're saying, oh yeah, so-and-so deals with fraud down there, or that's the fraud department. It's not actually related to our core business, which is selling widgets or providing a service. You know, that's the wrong culture. That's the wrong attitude. The attitude has got to be a buy-in from everybody, and it's got to start at the top. And that's where we need to do more in our education and advisory process.
Yeah, and you are nodding, Mia, so let me just bring you in on this.
I would totally agree with everything Tim has said there. Tone at the top is crucially important, having the right culture within the organisation. You know, I think it's very clear that it's not going to be possible for the police to take charge and investigate every fraud that's reported to it. I think, you know, current statistics really demonstrate that. What we hope is there might be an improvement. But organisations have to take some responsibility themselves, and creating the right culture where people are aware of the risks of fraud, are taking active steps to prevent it, and working with other parts of the business to encourage people to come forward with concerns are really, really important considerations. And that all comes back to the ethics and the culture within the organisation itself, and the attitude it has towards managing fraud as a business risk.
Yeah, and so this is about organisations doing a bit more. Let me come to two other things though, and perhaps you spoke just now, Janice, about the fact that we were discussing about the process by which something becomes a fraud or not. And there is a key question Gavin Cunningham raises about who decides what is actually fraudulent. And of course, that's at the heart of this issue, Janice, as you were saying just now. And I suppose ultimately that's a very difficult one to police, and it's part of what came out of the research, Janice, about the difficulty of specifying that in a meaningful way. Do you just want to comment briefly, Janice, and I'll come to Tim and Amir to look at some of the implications.
Yes, as you say, Martin, it's a difficult one, and I remember we had a lot of debate at the time of how we were actually going to define that for fraud for this particular survey. Everything seems to be different on this. I think one of the things that came out was really the crucial thing of, if a system went ahead, was having the ease of reporting, and really the main issue there was, is this going to be easy, and what are these definitions going to be? And as Tim said earlier, it's very difficult to actually define fraud and to actually pick those levels, but that's what it's crucial to how the system will work actually. And I think there needs to be more debate on exactly what fraud is to be reported, and what the definition is, and at what stage to be reported. You know, we had a lot of debate about when does the suspicion become more definite that it's a fraud.
Yeah, and this, by the way, if you as a lecturer, as by background I am, you start off with what's a fraud, of course, and what does economic crime mean? And oh my goodness, immediately you get into a whole course all of its own. So we'll revisit that, I'm sure, at some other point, but not now. Let me come to some of the implications, though. Perhaps I'll come to you first, and just a couple that have come up in questions. Amar here talks about the role of trade associations in reporting fraud and engaging them. We've got another question about how it's all going to be funded. Could the Proceeds of Crime Act be dealt with? And another question looking at in-house legal teams and the fact that internally there are barriers to making this happen. I wonder that I can come to you, Mia. Of course, these are realities, aren't they? Funding, internal barriers, making collaboration meaningful between associations, let alone policing groups. And really, aren't these all prerequisites to any appeal to a bigger authority, so to speak, about pushing this forward?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think, you know, if this research has done nothing more than it already has, and I think it has actually contributed a huge amount here in terms of this discussion and debate, is it has actually opened up for a lot more questions to come to the fore. I mean, it probably raises lots more questions that we need to ask and discuss and debate in a lot more detail. And some of these that have been raised today are key to that. I think that the comment that Tony has put in his box around the trade associations and the need for greater collaboration and working together is crucial. I mean, if we really do want to make a difference in combating fraud, we do need to collaborate more. We need to share best practice. We need to come together and work together in order to come up with effective solutions and take joint action. So I think that's really, really crucial. And, you know, that will take a lot of discussion and debate. You know, there are challenges. We already know that. There's lots of barriers to organisations wanting to work together and share information. They're being broken down gradually, but I'm sure there's ways we could accelerate that and make more of a difference.
Yeah, thanks, Mia. I'll come to you on this as well, Tim. Obviously, this is something that you've thought about over the years. Tim?
Yeah, I think it's right as well that there's a big issue here. And I know that the government has done a lot to have this private public sharing of information, but the barrier appears to be that it's a bit of a one-way street, in that the private sector are happy to share their information with the public sector, but when it comes to trying to either, I was talking to somebody the other day, they were saying, you know, we had to struggle with this because we were providing the police with all of this information. They weren't providing us with any, but even worse, they weren't giving us any feedback about what was happening to the data we'd actually provided them with. So it really does need to be more of a two-way flow of information. But the sharing of information, despite GDPR and all of the other bits and pieces, the sharing of information is a good thing. And to just quickly, Martin, give you an example of this. The ACFE had a round table for its corporate alliance members. I sat with a group of 12 bankers and I posed the question, you know, who investigates your suspicious activity reports or who reports them? 12 different answers came across the table. And I said, guys, you know, you're not only in the same, you know, sector, the financial sector, you're all actually bankers. Shouldn't there be some degree of, you know, normality here? Shouldn't there be some sort of process or procedure? And of course, everybody shared a lot of information, so much so that we had to throw the entire group out an hour and a half later because they were sharing information, which was the first time they'd done so under Chatham House rules for a long, long time. Sharing information is never not a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. It just sounds, you know, when you look at some of the barriers to this as well, Tim, it seems incredible, really, because it's seen everywhere you go. And this is across the world of economic crime and the world of security generally. This world of sharing information is the answer. It seems obvious. It's just, my goodness, isn't that a challenge, and one that really needs to be tackled. Just very quickly, conscious of the time, go to a question from Matt Pearson first. Now, Janice, let's come in on this question if you wouldn't mind. It's an answer in terms of Was there any distinction between the mandatory reporting of employee internal fraud versus external fraud? Just that general point, if you can answer. As Tim says, you may not want to report each small employee expenses fraud, but there was a greater desire to report customers deliberately defrauding the company. And it's just about that sense, once again, of what gets on the agenda. Janice first.
Yes, I know there was no sort of distinction between the two there. I think what we need to look at is where people said that they didn't sort of trust senior managers to actually report frauds that were ongoing because of how it would reflect on themselves. And I think once again comes back to what we said, certainly that Tim and Mia have emphasised, you know, this is important to the tone at the top, and certainly board members actually setting that and sticking to it themselves.
Okay, and this is something Liz Sandwith picks up with and makes a point. Okay, let me just start to bring this to a conclusion. I'm going to just ask Tim and Mia very quickly, 1 minute each, if you wouldn't mind. Mia, from your point of view, fraud advisory panel, next steps, what's going to happen from now on?
So from our perspective, we're really keen to ensure that this discussion continues. I think, you know, it's a complex and challenging one, and I know that opinion on the whole issue of mandatory reporting is quite divided, but I think it's a really important debate to have, and we're really keen to ensure that that will continue. So we are going to continue to talk to our members and others about this issue. We are also looking at one of the other issues that have been highlighted in the chat today around how where organisations can report fraud, and whether or not there's a need for some of that to be consolidated and made easier for organisations too. From our point of view, this is a really important topic. It's something we feel that we need to address and actually come up with some practical solutions. So we'll be working hopefully with yourselves and with Tim and with others to see what we can do to really contribute some positive solutions to this sort of very difficult and challenging question. Thank you.
Maria, thank you very much indeed. And Tim, this all started off when you said, I want to get an important research project going, and it flowed on from that conversation we had a while back. From your point of view, Tim, you happy with where we are and what next?
Yeah, I am. And I take the opportunity to thank you and Janice for what I consider to be an excellent report, and thank Mia and Zara from the Fraud Advisory Panel for pulling this all together. As I said, we asked the Fraud Advisory Panel to join us on this quest because they are really a very influential voice, far bigger so than the ACFE UK chapter. So we look to them to help promote this and to help take it forward. Certainly there's other actors that need to come in to join the debate and to contribute to the debate. The ACFE UK chapter will do what it can to assist, and if we need to do some further research or provide some statistics from the US or globally, we'll do so. But as Mia says, it's an important, difficult, challenging, it's all of those things. We don't know, you know, just things like the definition of fraud and what should be reported and what shouldn't be. They're all very, very difficult, and everybody's got their own point of view and they're coming at it for their own angle. But to try and get something moving forward has got to be a step in the right direction, because people, we are all suffering from fraud big time, more so now than ever before. And we've got to get ahead of the game. We've got to get ahead of the curve, or at least try and fight back. And we need to do that collectively.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Janice for her contribution today as well in reporting the findings. Must say we run thought leadership webinars. We've done 138 so far. We've got one on Thursday, the 21st of October, where we'll be building on this report and taking some of the issues forward. 3:30 in the afternoon, just 45 minutes. So please do join us then. Thank you so much indeed once again to Tim, Janice and to Mia, to Zara in the background, to my colleagues, Sarah Gray and Charlotte Howell, who've been putting all this together, and to you, the audience, for your questions, your engagement, and for your support of this topic area. We hope to see you again. Until we see you again, I hope it's not too long. Stay safe.